Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable discussion, a discussion on a food systems approach to transforming Africa's soil health. We look into policies, science, implementation, and impact. We have a panel today, a very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Richard Makandaweri. He is the African Director of the Alliance for African Partnerships and the Chairperson of the Malawi National Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Makandaweri. We then have nobody less than Dr. Ratan Lal. He is the World Food Prize Laureate of 2020 and Professor of Soil Science at Ohio State University. Thank you, Dr. Lal, for being with us. Then we have Dr. Umu Kamara. She's the Regional Director, North and West Africa for IFDC. Thank you, Umu. We're supposed to have Julie Borlaug, the granddaughter of the Nobel Prize laureate, of course, Dr. Norman Borlaug. Unfortunately, she could not make it this morning. I myself, good morning, nice meeting you. I'm Prem Bindraban. I'm a program director of a program called Fertilizer Research and Responsible Implementation in Ghana. I will facilitate the conversation today. There will be an opportunity for you as participants to ask questions. You can type them in the chat. I also like to introduce Constance Muyem Yembe. She will be moderating today's event. Constance is currently an Atlas Corps Fellow and former Mandela Washington Fellow. With that, I would like to start off with a slide presentation to introduce the discussions. Okay, buckle up. I'll run through this quickly. It's just an introduction on soil health strategies for sustainable food systems in Africa. One thing that we see, unfortunately, happening is an enormous expansion of the crop area on the African continent. The red lines go up. It almost doubled in the past 40, 50 years. While in Europe and Northern America, developed countries, we see that the cropping area actually is going down. Now, this increase has disadvantages. It leads to loss of biodiversity, degradation of the soils, loss of greenhouse gas emissions because of the composition of our soil organic matter, and we can lose even up to 50% when we clear our lands. The issue is that, let's say, the clearing of the land contributes much more to greenhouse gas emissions equal to fossil fuel use on the African continent rather than agriculture per se. So land clearing is a real issue. So how does all this happen? The yields are increasing in European and American countries. And what we see is that the yields remain almost virtually unchanged on the Western and Eastern African regions that we have plotted here. All this tends to relate to fertilizer use. The green lines are again Europe and the United States. In the mid-80s, there were some interventions in Europe, so the fertilizer use decreased, but it's still in the order of 150 kilograms per hectare of NPK. And the fertilizer use, the red lines in West Africa, East Africa, African continent, is at 10-20 kg per hectare. How does it relate to yield? You can look at the yellow line, which is the maize yields on in Northern America. The blue line are the yields on the European continent. And you can see the decline in fertilizer use here. But overall, with increasing fertilizers, we see an increasing yield. The African continent, Eastern and Western Africa, are somewhere down here. Expanded, you can see indeed that fertilizer application and yield are somewhat related, but again, we are somewhere around zero over here. So this keeps our yields very low. Now, the high yields and the high use of fertilizers and other inputs in developing countries, along with the drivers of economies of scale, have led to all these large-scale production systems, like these mega farms in Brazil. We have all these mega stables with chicken and pig production. It leads to cheap food and we end up with problems like obesity. So we kind of see a movement in the Western world, primarily a global dialogue on agriculture system, whereby going back to nature, where small is beautiful, the feel good is actually dominating. So we have systems like organic agriculture that rejects the use of agrochemicals. We have dialogues on agroecological approaches. Basically, they want to change entire societal structure and changing the production system. Also, not using agrochemicals, or at least minimizing them, but the discourse tends towards rejection of these inputs. Recently, we have regenerative agriculture. Generally, these are large tracts of lands with long-term that are needed. Overall, the yields on this production are generally lower per hectare, which means that you need more land. The losses from organic manure or fertilizers are basically comparable to mineral fertilizers. Labor requirement is double or even more than double, and these systems need to be subsidized to be economically viable. But these are the dialogues generally coming from developed nations because of the concerns of food chiefs, large-scale production systems, obesity, etc. But how does this relate to the African systems? There seems to be quite a mismatch. We don't have these enormous large-scale production systems on the African continent, and it's rather a completely different dialogue. So let's go back to basics. Not using inputs, for instance, could become a very serious issue. So this is a maize crop grown under rain-fed conditions without fertilizers. We see a pale maize crop, and here we have added fertilizers. And basically what we see is that it is due to the lack of nutrients that this crop was not growing. So fertilizers are food for our plants to increase the yields and feed the people. This is an example of the nutrient balances. This is Western Germany, for instance, where the input of nutrients and the outputs of nutrients basically balance out positively, meaning that we introduce more nutrients into the system than comes out of the system. While in Tanzania, actually, there is a depletion of nutrients, which is negative here at about 27 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And this is true basically for the entire African continent, where we see a lot of degradation, a lot of nutrient depletion, resulting in actually reducing rather than increasing yields. So what are the characteristics of the African systems? It's small scale. There's enormous pressure on land, continuous cropping. We have agronomic practices with very low use of external inputs. We see burning of crop residues, limited organic manure is available, very low use of fertilizers, and we have this enormous expansion of agricultural land to meet the growing needs of our people. 80% of the food volume increase comes from expansion of agricultural land rather than from yield increase. Now, clearly, all that leads to soil degradation, loss of biodiversity, emissions of greenhouse gases, hunger and poverty, and even societal instability. So clearly, this is not a viable path of development. We will have to enhance and work on the soil fertility of the systems on the African continent. Soil organic matter is really key and essential. Its buildup is slow, but we must work on it. It's important to boost the efficiency of the fertilizers that are used. It's important to boost the efficiency of water that is used. One thing that we tend to forget is that carbon sequestration comes with the sequestration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, for instance. This is plant material that has to be put back into the soil, and it comes with all these additional nutrients as well. Soil pH is another very important driver that we could improve, but only when it's really very low and it's a costly business to line. These are probably the two most important soil fertility properties, and apart, of course, from soil physical, environmental, and genetics. Let me add one dimension to it. Fertilization is not just needed for yield increase. These are soils with limited zinc availability, for instance, and these are countries where humans have zinc deficiencies. and you look at the patterns, they look quite similar. So there is also this very strong relation between plant nutrition and human health. In this graph, you can see that after the Second World War, when we pushed up our yields, we basically decreased the concentrations of zinc and copper and iron in our produce. So when I eat 100 grams of maize today, I may get only half the amount of zinc that I did when I would eat it in 1960, which is nutritionally, of course, not such a great idea. And this is not just true for grains, it's also true for other fruits and vegetables as well. And we can do something about it, for instance, with smart fertilization to increase those nutrient concentrations. We call that agronomic fortification. Now, fertilizers themselves are essential, but there's one dimension I would like to add to it, which is water. Basically, fires water through its stomata. When it's wide open, water transpires out of the plant, but at the same time, carbon dioxide comes in. The carbon dioxide is needed for the growth, which means that when it's wide open, we have high transpiration and we have high inflow. When it's closed, it all goes down. So basically, there is a linear relation between water consumption, water used by plants, and photosynthesis. Unfortunately, if the plant has limitations of nutrients, for instance, then this relation drops. So it reduces the use efficiency of actually everything, and it further gets repressed with additional problems. In practice, it looks like this. We see a similar pattern. All these dots over here imply that there are other factors that affect the yield. Same thing with rainfall. This is another location. You see the same pattern happening here, which means that in case of rainfall, we should prevent runoff. But in addition to all that, we have to work on fertilization and good agronomic practices. So water and nutrients really go hand in hand, which means that we have to combine integrated soil fertility management with soil and water conservation practices. We need a landscape approach because having interventions at just a farm level will not do the trick. You will need communities, you will need people along, let's say, a watershed to integrate, to align their activities so that we have large impact. Soil and water conservation is something that cannot be done just at the farm level. So we need these integrated approaches, integrated farm, communal and regional interventions that have to be combined. Apply integrated soil fertility management and soil water conservation. We need in situ production of manure. Transporting all this manure is a very costly business if it's available at all. And we need smart fertilization that needs to be crop and site specific in order to improve yields, to improve the nutritional quality and plant health and resilience. We need an agricultural revolution in Africa. It must be uniquely African. There should be an African voice probably in the global food systems dialogue to counter the current discussions or to tune it to African needs. It should be clear that soil health is not solely a responsibility of the farmers to take care of. Everybody benefits, multiple actors, we benefit from it by eating the produce of the fruits. So somehow we should also contribute to generate value for soils so that farmers can make that investment. So the question is how we can feed the African population in a sustainable way. And I would like to leave it up to the panel to discuss all that. So from here on, I would like to ask Constance. Constance, could you join us and ask the questions to the panels?